It is Saturday, but we are still working for Crusoe. It is Saturday, June 15th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. Thank you all for waiting one extra day for this episode of Working for Crusoe. The Fed says there will be a rate cut this year, but only one. The center holds in the European Union parliamentary elections barely. But a hard right-wing victory in France leads to centrist, moderate President Emmanuel Macron calling for snap elections, like very quickly in France. So, Sam Park, let's start with the Fed, who have not completely abandoned their promise to cut rates this year, but they met Wednesday, and Chairman Powell saying that there's probably only going to be one rate cut in calendar 2024.
Well, he didn't exactly say that.
Well, he implied.
Yeah, very strongly, yes.
But yeah, there was a revision in the Fed's outlook for rate cuts. So just one in 2024. And that is simply just the long tail of their death match with inflation, I guess, right? Their long and extended kind of Greco-Roman style wrestling with the inflation.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, they set a target rate for the end of the year, which is about a quarter point less than where the rate is now. So since they generally cut rates by a quarter point, that pretty much means that there's only going to be one rate cut this year. And I think everybody had pretty much figured that out by now. But inflation is still cooling very slowly, perhaps a bit faster than it was earlier this year, but there was still a pretty strong jobs report a couple of weeks ago, or a week or two ago, that we discussed, which was not quite as strong as some of the other reports we've seen, but it still shows a healthy addition of jobs to the U.S. economy. So, as you say, the struggle against inflation is likely going to take longer than many people had hoped it would, I think, including all of us. You know, inflation is just bad for everybody, and we would like it all to be over very, very soon.
But just to be clear, the reason inflation has taken longer than anticipated to go away is because the consumer spending in the United States remains strong.
Yes. And also, it's partly fueled by a large increase in consumer debt. Things like credit card delinquencies are rising very sharply. And people are upset about higher prices, but they are paying them. Right. There's only recently does it seem as though people are sort of switching to budget brands and things like this. Instead, they just seem to be going into debt instead, which is probably not a very good idea for them. But I can't say that I've been immune from this. So it's not something that I feel empowered to wag my finger at anybody else about.
But same.
Yeah. And so especially, what with higher interest rates, higher levels of debt. And I think a lot of consumers may not be quite as aware of that as we would hope, right? They all of a sudden see that their credit card bills are higher just because the interest rates are higher.
Let's pivot to the 2024 European Parliamentary elections.
Yes.
They finished up on the 9th of June. 357 million people eligible to vote in 27 countries. This was the first European parliamentary election after Brexit. It also is the first European parliamentary election since a 2023 European Council increase of the number of parliamentary seats from 705 to 720. That means 361 now needed for a majority. And I'll hand it over to Politico, who I think encapsulates the results very well. Europe's conservatives are ecstatic, says Politico. The European People's Party, the EPP, scored a clear victory in the parliamentary election, tightening its grip on the chamber, even as far-right groups made major gains across the bloc. The center-right force, that's the European People's Party, is on track to have about 184 lawmakers in parliament. Okay, so that's Ursula's party, right? The European People's Party.
Correct. Yeah. She's, as a member of the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, they sit in the party grouping of the European People's Party. Correct.
Okay. So and Politico did great reporting on this, and the New York Times has done really good reporting on this. I'm just going to throw at you what I have gleaned from this. Normal kind of center-right conservatives have won big. The Greens and the Liberals have kind of taken it on the chin. But more broadly, far-right groups performed very well in France, Germany, Italy, and other places. Not winning a majority, but growing their bloc. Do I have that right?
Growing, sure. Not very much, though. I mean, we've got a 720-seat parliament. The two main far-right groupings are what's called the European Conservatives and Reformists, or ECR, that what we might call the near far right, and the farther right Identity and Democracy grouping, which is farther right than the ECR. Between them, they gained about a dozen seats. And that's about the same as the EPP, European People's Party, the center-right grouping, gained. So that doesn't seem to be a large gain for the far right. As you say, the big losers were the Greens, who lost up to about 20 seats, and the Renew Europe grouping, which is the sort of centrist liberal grouping, liberal in the European sense, mind you, of being very pro-free market and liberal on social issues such as gay rights and women's rights and things like that, who lost a couple dozen seats. I think they were the big loser of the night. But I think the reason people are framing this as a victory for the far right is especially because those far-right parties gained large numbers of seats in France and Germany in particular. And France and Germany have always been the sort of binary star system around which the rest of the European Union revolves, at least, and even more so since
Brexit.
Great Britain left the European Union and drifted off in the deep, dark cold of outer space. And so it won't, for instance, some of the things that the European Parliament decides are what are now very important issues like immigration and agricultural policy and things like that. But most of the very important decisions still are made at the level of national governments. So the great results for the far right in France and Germany are really more sort of ominous about the possible future direction of their domestic political governments, as opposed to their influence inside of the European Parliament itself.
The other thing that is maybe a little bit challenging to track is that, like, for example, the National Rally, formerly the National Front, the ultra-nationalist French party that we will cover in the next segment more specifically to France, they're not running as the National Rally in the European Parliament, right? It's coalitions.
Yes, they're.
But you're not going to find. You're not going to find. The German alternative for Germany as a party within the European Parliament. They kind of have different team names. It's like you don't see Manchester United playing for England in the World Cup. You see England.
That's right. It's sort of like that, right? For instance, as you say, the Rassemblement National, the National Rally, they sit in the Identity and Democracy far-right grouping inside of the European Parliament, whereas the Brothers of Italy party, headed by Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, sits in the not quite so far-right ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists. And it's kind of baffling why there are two right-wing parties to the right of the center-right EPP. Because, in fact, if the ECR and the ID just formed one far-right party, they would actually have about the same number of seats as the Socialist and Democrats center-left grouping. They'd be very powerful.
They would have 131 seats.
Yes. And so I don't know exactly, and I don't, European politics, as our listeners are probably gathering by now, it's very complicated, right? There's so many parties. They don't have the same names. as their national parties. So you have to try and remember who sits in what party grouping. And it's very difficult to keep track of. And I think in many ways, European Parliament elections are sort of analogous to our midterm elections.
Yeah.
For example, I think there are millions of Americans who couldn't pick their House representative out of a lineup, right? They don't have any idea who sits in their district in the House. And similarly, many millions of Europeans have no idea who their Minister of European Parliament is either. And so, much like our midterm elections, European Parliament elections tend to be dominated by very politically active voters, right? And whereas more disengaged people often just stay home. And so that's one of the reasons, actually, why farther right parties do very well, because they have the most animated voting base, much as they do in parts of this country.
Yeah, it's like a midterm or almost like a primary in this country.
Yes, that's right.
As far as the kind of voter who participates.
Well, I would say it's much more like a midterm, just because
Okay.
it is a multi-party
Right.
affair, in fact.
Right. Okay, so this is it too cynical or too doomer to say, my God, Europe just went really anti-immigration?
No, I don't think so. But is it more so than this country? I don't.
No.
Immigration is an enormous issue all the way across the Western world, but it's worth taking a look at that in a tiny bit more detail. For example, as we were discussing, the Brothers of Italy is in the not quite so far right ECR grouping under the leadership of Prime Minister Meloni. And as you might recall, here in our country, there was a bipartisan deal on immigration struck at the beginning of this year, but then Donald Trump piped up and urged the congressional Republicans to kill it because he didn't want to give Biden a win on immigration. I think that Marine Le Pen, the head of the National Rally in France, would have liked Giorgia Meloni to do something similar and just make sure nothing gets done on immigration in the European Union so that she could use it as an issue going into these European Parliament elections. But that's not what Giorgia Meloni did. She, in fact, has had numerous meetings with the heads of countries like Egypt and Tunisia, which are very important source and transit countries for immigrants coming to the European Union. So instead of just letting immigration be a wedge issue, she actually tried to solve the problem.
Well, she is the prime minister of Italy. I mean,
That's
she actually
right.
has a job to do.
Exactly. But she could have, she could have done nothing. She could have just waited a few months and not done anything about it. Instead, she acted like a responsible governing politician,
Public servant,
which
yeah.
not every Italian conservative does, I can assure you.
Sure.
Right. And so Meloni is, in a way, she's certainly on the far right, but she's sort of in the new far right. She's an institutional conservative as well as being a social conservative. She, for instance, is very pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia in the
Okay. I'm glad you brought that up.
Ukraine war, right? Which certainly differentiates her also from Marine Le Pen. And in fact, President von der Leyen has made a point of trying to maintain very good relations with Prime Minister Meloni and sort of try to peel her away from the further right wings of European politics. Not entirely successfully, but seemingly successfully enough for President von der Leyen, that is.
Okay, so Ursula von der Leyen may remain in office as the president of the European Commission.
I believe she will, yeah.
But it's not a slam dunk. But before
she needs to be voted in.
Yeah. But before we drill down on that, if you wish to,
not really.
Another thing I wanted to kind of kick around here was, my initial thought was, well, this is kind of immigration and in particular, people in Europe, voters in Europe, really kind of feeling uneasy about immigration and wanting a more restrictive tone, at least in the European Union Parliament. But also I thought, oh, is this because there's a land war in Europe and there's a belligerent Russia? But then I realized the right wing, the right side, the right hemisphere of this winning group that is yet to really form a coalition, they're not all on side when it comes to how they feel about Russia or NATO or Ukraine, as you touched on with Meloni, because like Le Pen, the French ultranationalist, anti-NATO. And then also you have, I think, 10 representatives of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's Fidesz party who have won. And then there's a Bulgarian pro-Kremlin party called the Revival Party. They won 3 seats. So within the right of the European Parliament, you don't have consensus about the Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, that is to the right of the EPP, right? The EPP
that's right.
Is still the largest right-wing grouping, and they're
pro-Ukraine,
right, and they're entirely pro-Ukraine.
Right.
So across the right in total, I would say there's still a very strong consensus of being in favor of Ukraine in their war against Russia.
But you cannot connect the dots completely, or really you cannot in good faith say, oh, this right turn is a response to Russian aggression, because in fact, some of the people who have picked up seats actually would prefer Russia win the war.
Oh, entirely. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Which is a bit confusing.
It is, but this is, for instance, John, you and I are Americans, right? I mean, we're just used to having 2 parties, and that's the end of the story, right? And
one side's the environmentalists, and the other sides are the hawks, like traditionally.
Yeah, but even in our country, these sort of identities are shifting a little bit.
Yeah,
right. I mean, now
certainly
it's the right-wing party that's more in favor of Vladimir Putin. And that, I think, is surprising to many people. Although, as we've discussed before, perhaps it shouldn't be quite as surprising as it is.
So the last election in 2018, it was Greens. It was the Green Deal, the signature issue for the European Parliament. And I mean, can we say that immigration and maybe, belligerent Russia or just a fraught international scene right now have kind of maybe moved environmental or climate concerns to the back burner for voters?
I don't know if that's the reason, but those concerns certainly have been moved to the back burner. I think that inflation has combined with the realization on the part of the European populace that the transition to a green economy is going to cost them money, has really combined to really diminish the popularity of green policies all across Europe. People, costs are already high, and if you have to pay more money to go to a green economy, you're just bound to lose support for that. And I think, for instance, in Germany, this was a big problem, right? They really didn't handle their environmental policy very well. They had this terrible idea of making everybody buy heat pumps to replace their gas boilers. Right now, we're going to hand out generous subsidies for these heat pumps, but they were still very expensive. And in some homes, especially, in Europe, as compared to the United States, are very old, right? It's not easy to do this sort of thing. And so people got very angry about this. And
so angry they voted for, basically a descendant of the Nazi party, the Alternative for Germany.
Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD. They are now, they placed right behind the Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union bloc, the center-right grouping, to become the second largest parliamentary grouping in the German contingent of the European Parliament. They placed above all 3 parties in the 3-party coalition that now governs Germany, none of which, as far as I can tell, got more than about 15% of the vote.
Okay, so
these are the parties that are in the government right now.
Let's repeat this. Alternative for Germany, or AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, is the descendant of the Nazi party, and they just won bigger than any other party in office in Germany, because people hate immigrants and heat pumps.
Yes. Now, mind you, they had the biggest gains, but they still only got about 16% of the vote, right? And so it's not like they're crushing everything, right? The biggest gainer.
I mean, that's kind of like MAGA here, right? I mean, it's a little bit
It's
smaller than MAGA,
it is
but
smaller, yeah. But
yeah.
The big winner in Germany was actually the CDU CSU alliance, right? Which was the party of Angela Merkel when she was prime chancellor, that is, for 16 years, and in
Right.
fact, it's the origin party of President von der Leyen herself today, and so they're the mainstream center right, sort of they're the German version of the Republican Party here in the United States. And so Germany will go to national elections at the latest in the fall of next year. And so I think the governing three-way coalition is going to try to at least keep their heads down for another year and just suck it up. And I think they know that they're just probably going to get crushed next year.
Again, Alternative for Germany has been designated a suspected extremist group by German authorities who
Yes.
historically have taken things like neo-Nazis very seriously. So
yes. And in fact,
fasten your seatbelts, folks. The Nazis just got 16% of the vote in Germany.
They might have done even better. In fact, except that they've been embroiled in a few different scandals very recently, in the past month or two, with, spying for China, taking money from Russia, things like this, which you might be alarmed about. But we'll have to see. There's a sort of still some residual antibodies against fascism inside of Germany, but these antibodies may not be as numerous or as strong as we might hope.
And they might not exist as strongly or as in great numbers in France, where we had ultra-nationalist Marine Le Pen's party, the National Rally, which I believe I referred to by their old name, the National Front, earlier.
Yes.
But they are the, what is it? Rassemblement National?
That's exactly right.
Thank you. They won 31.5% of the vote in the European parliamentary elections, more than twice the 15% projected for President Macron's Liberal Renaissance Party. That's center left, right? They're centrist, center left.
I would say they're centrist. I would just call them centrist.
Centrist, yeah, moderate.
For example, in the European Parliament, they sit in the Renew Europe bloc, which is the centrist sort of neoliberal bloc.
Okay. So Macron gets beaten by these French ultra-nationalists. And again, Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, founded the National Front in 1972. He resigned in 2011. I mean, he was like a toxic, kind of repugnant figure in French politics, right? And then his daughter, Marine, has come on and maybe rebranded it a little bit, made it be like ultra-nationalism that is socially acceptable. Is that
yes, I would say so. But however, Jean-Marie, old man Le Pen, was not quite so toxic that he couldn't secure a place in the runoff election in 2002, when he was soundly beaten by Jacques Chirac. And so, but yes, since then, his daughter
Marine ran in 17 and 22, right?
That's right, and lost both times. But she's gradually, over time, softened her message. Although
it's a kinder, gentler anti-immigration party.
That's right. For instance, she's dropped ideas like Frexit, for example, which she used to.
Although not from NATO.
That's right. She still talks about leaving NATO. But she no longer talks about leaving the euro, for example.
And also, the French have left NATO once before, but again, it's different when it's Charles de Gaulle.
Well, they didn't leave NATO; they just left the unified command. Right. They still remained a treaty ally.
Right.
But yes.
But these people are crazy, right? These are ultra nationalist extremists.
Oh, absolutely. And they have the largest block of French seats inside the European Parliament. And John. Now, we've only been doing this podcast for a couple of years, but I remember saying to you when Macron was first running back in 2017 that now there's things I don't like about Macron, but I wanted him to succeed. The problem that I saw then was that if he failed, he would leave the door wide open for the far right because his success had come at the expense of the traditional, or I shouldn't say traditional, but the established parties of the center right and center left. Macron was I believe the economy minister in the socialist government that immediately preceded his government.
Is that Francois Hollande?
Francois Hollande, yes.
Yeah.
He left the Hollande government, formed his own party in 2016, took some of his fellow socialists with him, and took people also from the center right. And in doing so, he essentially demolished the former two-party structure. Right. Now, having said that, France is not like the United States or even Great Britain or even Germany. For example, the governing structure of France, as we know, is referred to as the Fifth Republic. And that's because the first four didn't really turn out so well because war. The idea of forming your own party in France is not all that unusual compared to the way it is in other countries.
All right, so they're used to a little bit of tumult, which maybe makes the snap elections Macron called for at the end of this month and at the start of July maybe a little bit more normal for them.
Well, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say normal, but
because it's a pretty big gamble.
It's a very big gamble. In this respect, that is of forming new parties all the time. France is much more bears a much closer resemblance to Italy, right? Where there's new parties, every few years there's a new party, and they do very well. And so, this seems really crazy to us, but it's actually not quite. In fact,
you know what it's like, Sam? It's like relegation in European soccer. It seems crazy to us, but it's normal to them.
Yeah, and for instance, that party of Macron's is now called the Renaissance Party, but that's its third name in 8 years. And so this happens all the time. You form a new party, you change the name or something like this. And in fact, the party of Jacques Chirac was called, and this is, I really think, the stupidest political party name ever. It was the UMP, which stood for the Party for a United Movement. What the hell does that mean?
What?
Right?
A party for a party?
Yeah, it's like the party, right? We party all the time.
Yeah.
And
we're aligned in our alignment.
Yes, that's right. But of course, that was probably the best name they could come up with because it was much better than let's see if we can make Jacques Chirac the president, which was all that party was ever really about. Now they're called the Republicans or the Republican Party. But to return to Macron, people said they were surprised about him calling the snap election, which, granted, he did it even before the official results of the European Parliament elections had been announced.
I mean, I like it because he's like, look, if you really are a bunch of hard right ultra nationalists, French voters, let's have it out right now. I don't want to pretend like it's anything different. If this is
okay,
like no fig leaves for Macron, I appreciate it.
That's right. Okay, you did it. Let's see if you could do it again. Right. But the problem is, well, there are many, but one of those problems is that Macron is already in his second term as president. He can't serve a third consecutive term.
Right.
Although, from what I gather, he could take 5 years off and run again. I'm not sure if that's true, but I have heard commentators say that there's no actual limit in the number of terms on the French presidency.
It's just consecutive?
Yeah, you can only do 2 at a time. And I think they just assumed that by the time you're done with 2 terms, you've
had enough, or they've had enough of you,
or so unpopular that you wouldn't dream of running for a third term. Right. But Macron, I think he's younger than you, or about the same age as you.
I think he is. No, I think he might not be 45.
Right, but anyway, he's under 50. But I think people who said they were surprised. Now, granted, he didn't actually tell almost anybody that he was going to do this, but he did tell some people. There were rumors about this before the elections. It's just that almost everybody in his own party had not heard about this, but none of them should have been surprised, because to any of them, I think Macron would say, have you met me? I mean, this is so in character for Macron. This is exactly the sort of thing that he would do. I just think that people
it's dashing. He's re-seizing the initiative after a loss. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but it takes a lot of guts.
That's right. But it also helps shift the media narrative, right? Because immediately the story shifts from dramatic victory for the RN to Macron fights back, right? And takes decisive action, right? And so on that level, you could totally understand why he would do something like this.
All right. But Sam, what if the National Rally wins? What if France embraces an ultra-nationalist, hard-right, anti-immigration government and wants to leave NATO.
That's a real possibility. But the thing is, for the next 3 years, Macron will still be president, right? The RN won't be able, they won't be able to do that by themselves.
Yeah, because he's not prime minister, he's president.
That's right. And just like in the United States, the French Constitution gives the president wide latitude.
Right.
And the idea, I think, that Macron might think that if the RN actually has to have, for instance, the prime ministership and actually run the country, that they'll do such a bad job of it that things will be better by the time the next election rolls around, which he can't even run in anyway. But again, you can see why people in his party would be upset, because a bunch of them just lost their seats. A bunch of them are going to lose their seats in a couple of weeks when the parliamentary election rolls around. There's no question about that. The question is, how many? And so it's almost like he just threw a grenade in there and then walked away, because he won't catch any of the direct fallout at all.
There's enough hard right, ultra-nationalist, anti-established, rules-based order happening in governments I care about. It's terrifying, Sam.
Already, the results of this have been surprising. For example,
you mean how it's reshuffling France? Like, it has united the left there.
Yes, it has united the left, which...
Francois Hollande, the former president, didn't he basically say, all right, all socialists fall in?
Not just that, but they've formed a four-way alliance with the far left, and I mean crazy far left, La France Insoumise, which generally translates as France Unbowed. So it's the socialists, France Unbowed, the Communist Party of France, and the Greens, right? And so, and nobody actually saw that coming. The French left, partly because of Macron himself, who took some of his former socialists with him, the French left has been deeply divided and fragmented ever since Macron took office, and actually ever since he began to run. And of course, we recall last year that we covered on this show when he invoked special presidential constitutional powers to reform the pension system. That is, essentially reduce pension systems. He was already very unpopular on the left before that. And now it's like he's just poison to them, which I think is a big problem here. Because if you really want to hold off the far right, then the best thing really would be for Macron's people to unite with this four-way leftist coalition called the Popular Front. Geez, don't strain yourselves, guys. But if Macron and united with the Popular Front, they could probably win. But that's off the table, right?
However, the right is splintered, right? The Republicans, the French Republicans, as you mentioned, or the Republican Party, they're having a leadership crisis.
Yes, they're the center-right party, right? Although they've been very small for a long time now.
But they're not going to align. I mean, they won't all align with Le Pen, right?
Well, I mean, for instance, it seems as though almost none of them will, except for the president of the party, Eric Ciotti, who... And
then they tried to sack him, and he locked himself in his office.
Yes, he announced, I believe it was on Tuesday, right, that he would, in fact, his party would, in fact, join an alliance with the National Rally. At which point, the head of the Republicans in the Senate, a fellow named Bruno Retailleau, came out and said, no, we're not going to do that. And by the way, if Ciotti says we are going to, that means he lied to me to my face yesterday when he told me that he would not consider doing anything of the kind. And then, as you say, and the Republicans ousted Ciotti, or at least thought they
attempted to,
right? And they said, no, you're no longer the president of the party. And he said, yes, I am. and locked himself inside the party headquarters after dismissing the office staff. Now, as it turned out later, right here at the end of the week, a French court said that for some reason, and I don't understand why this works, but that the Republicans could not or had improperly ousted COT. So as far as I know, he's still the president of the Republican Party. But it looks as though they are not going to form an alliance with the far right. So far, anyway. But this is just crazy. I mean, this has been one of the craziest weeks in politics that I've ever seen. And I don't think this is another after effect of Macron's decision that people didn't really see coming, right? The idea that the left would unite and the right would fragment. Now, it's not. I don't think it's bad news at all, right? But it really wasn't anticipated. And for that matter, there's another further right party in France called Reconquête, that is reconquered, and their most famous member is Marion Maréchal, who is the niece of the RN leader Marine Le Pen. And that party is led by an absolute right-wing nutjob who's in fact worse than Marine Le Pen.
That's pretty far right, Sam.
Yes. And he refused to form an alliance with the RN. And so Maréchal has, I can't tell if she resigned from the party or was kicked out of the party for suggesting that they should form a far-right alliance with the RN. So I'm imagining she's going to join the RN, but I don't actually. But this is all just really, I think people are very nervous in France right now. And of course, they're about to host the Olympics.
Okay, so voting scheduled in France, June 30th and July 7th. Candidacies have to be officially filed by tomorrow night, Sunday night. We're recording this Saturday evening, so that's coming up real quick in France.
Yes, and I think one of the reasons that Macron thought this might be a good idea was just because of that two-round structure, right? And especially if now, of course, he didn't anticipate the alliance of the left, but if all the left-wing candidates sort of stay out of each other's way in competitive seats, they can leverage the two-round structure to make sure that one of them ends up facing off directly against the far-right candidate and hopefully beating them.
Okay, you have updates on South Africa and Sudan, and then we've got some big stories coming up in Europe next week too.
Yes. Well, speaking of coalitions, as we reported a couple of weeks ago when South Africa went to elections, the governing African National Congress Party, which has, again, governed South Africa since the end of apartheid with an absolute majority, lost their majority in parliament in those recent elections. And so they, this week, announced that they have formed a governing coalition with the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. And so, in general, I would say this is good news if it holds up. The problem is that, as we said, the ANC has never had to sit in coalition, so they don't really know how to do it. And the Democratic Alliance has never been in the federal government at all. They've governed a state or two here or there. And so there's a lot of people in the ANC who are used to running the show who are about to lose their ministerial and or cabinet positions. And some of them might become disgruntled and cause trouble. I'm not saying they will, but it's a danger. But this is a very broad and therefore that is numerous coalition. So they can stand a fair number of defections should any arise. And so this is good news, I would say, for South Africa in general. And at the end of this week, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution demanding that the Sudanese Rapid Support Forces, that is the rebel group contesting with the Sudanese Armed Forces for control of the country in their horrifying civil war, that is, the UN demanded that the RSF and their siege of the city in Darfur called Al-Fashir, which has been going on for about a month, I think, or several weeks at least. It's the capital of Darfur. It's a city of about 1.5 million people. That is, it was before the war. Now, many thousands of people have fled there since the beginning of the war to seek whatever safety they can find there. It's the last city in Darfur that's still held by government forces. And so we've talked many times on this show about how we might wish that the Sudanese civil war has received more attention from the international community. And I'm happy to see that it's receiving some.
Okay, next week we'll hit the G7 and talk about Ukraine.
Yes, these conferences are actually going on right now, but they do sort of blend together very well. The G7, that is, Ukraine was a topic discussed in the G7 conference, which is wrapping up, and the Ukrainian peace conference is just getting started in Switzerland right now. And so we'll talk about both of these things next week.
All right, thanks for waiting an extra day as my schedule shifted around a little bit on me. So thanks for being with us on this.
Once you start working for Crusoe, you never stop.
Yeah, you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave.
Honestly, I think one of the reasons Macron might have called these elections is just because he's just like us. He's got elections fever, John, right? He's been spiking vote totals into his arm all year long, and he just can't stop. And now he gets to have 2 rounds.
Sam, I mean, as a second generation journalist, let me tell you, elections way more interesting than governance.
Yes. I would
much better stories to cover.
Well, look, as a sportscaster, it's right up.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's like you can either cover the game or you can cover the offseason. Yeah. The game's more exciting.
The problem is that this particular European elections game, it's tough, right? Oh. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of rules.
All right. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. We will talk to you next Friday. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.